I want to start tonight with the Cold War, going into the Third World as it moves away from this European central focus, and it started moving away in some places in the early to mid-50s. But I find it very useful to explain a lot of the protests that start breaking out politically in the United States in the 60s. It was in direct response to what the United States was doing in foreign policy, and also merged with the Civil Rights Movement. We'll talk about that later. So the Cold War, the second part in my mind, the first part being to set it up in Europe and define it, get it going. The Cold War in Europe was very clearly a strategic and military kind of public relations battle between the United States and the Soviets in Europe to decide which way Europe would go. Would it go toward American-style politics and economics or Soviet-style politics and economics? And the American people were very solidly behind the U.S. Cold War effort in Europe because the United States defined itself as supporting freedom, eliminating dictatorships, and allowing people to build capitalism, which gives them the freedom to go off and buy largely whatever they want if they can afford it. So the American public was very generally in support of the Cold War being fought, being waged in Europe in a lot of different ways. They disagreed about how exactly to do it, but the American public and Western Europe in general is very much behind, supportive of the American presence in Europe. That changes very dramatically in what we would call the Third World, which is basically the poverty-ridden countries of the planet. And some of them still are today. U.S. foreign policy relations with those places starts looking very untrustworthy, very undemocratic, and very bloody very, very fast. So you start getting accusations of the United States leaders being hypocrites, saying they're going to spread freedom, they're going to help people, when in fact they normally set up dictatorships and suppress democracy in a whole lot of places. So to discuss this tends to anger a lot of Americans who have never heard this kind of story before. They only hear the kind of cheerleader side of it. Yes, the United States does everything that is great and justified. It's always on the side of peace and humanity and the whole planet. That's a very idealistic view to take. And it's very easy to attack when you look at the other side. So some general ideas coming out of the early Cold War in Europe that now start getting toyed with as the Cold War spreads to much of the rest of the globe. Number one, this first started to happen seemingly, God, I can't talk, in Korea. Apparently in Korea. Do the Elmo Fudd thing and just change the word. The Northern Korean invasion in June of 1950 caused a lot of panic in the United States because this seemed like a communist invasion against a more democratic and more free pro-Western government in South Korea. And this set off alarm bells throughout the United States, throughout the American public. The American public was completely focused on Europe. And all of a sudden you have the growth of communism, or the threatened growth of communism, in a part of the world that is far, far away. This seemed to prove to American foreign policy leaders that the Cold War was spreading, and that it's spreading under Stalin's orders from Moscow. There is a general belief that Stalin caused this. We now know, going into the Soviet archives and the North Korean, as much as we have access to them, archives, that Stalin had to be convinced, and this was the North Korean government that took it upon itself to invade the South. But it's very generally believed at that point in the 1950s that Stalin himself had told the North Koreans to go. So there's this fear that Stalin and the Soviet government has a worldwide policy of conquest and building dictatorships and oppressing people, and they look to spread communism wherever they can, usually at the point of a gun. The United States intervened in the Korean War under the auspices of the United Nations. They got UN Security Council approval to send basically UN troops into South Korea and push back the North Koreans those mostly ended up being American troops. So just like today, you have what the U.S. calls a coalition, but the United States makes up like 90% of the coalition. But that seemed to be the kind of starting gun for the Cold War to spread to other places. Some other things about the Cold War that come out of not just North Korea or the Korean experience, but also China. A lot of U.S. leaders will assume that revolutions or new governments that rise in areas that are coming out of colonization, these newly independent countries after the end of World War II, as the European empires fall apart in South Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, all over Africa, Latin America. As those European colonies become newly independent countries, a lot of their own indigenous people have elections, and they choose people from amongst them to lead their country democratically in a lot of instances. When those leaders start talking about building social welfare programs or housing for the poor or universal education or universal health care, a lot of American leaders in particular will define those newly independent government leaders as communists because they are doing socialist things. They want to take taxpayer money from their own people and build schools and hospitals and roads. They are building socialist programs. There's no doubt about that. But a lot of these countries were very poor, and a lot of these new leaders realized that if they're going to get reelected, they have to do something for poor people. But American leaders tended to believe in this very paranoid era of the growth of communism that any newly independent country that starts doing this wants to be a communist country and wants to form an alliance, a military alliance with the Soviet Union. Does that make sense? So we have a pretty big split very often between the reality on the ground in these newly independent places, what textbooks often call post-colonial nationalist governments, and what the American view of those governments are. And we'll see that over and over again. So that's a major problem. Another major problem is that U.S. foreign policy leaders develop a grand theory of the growth of communism. That if any one country in a region, quote, goes communist, like it caught the flu or something, then it will infect its neighbors. So they often talk about communism as spreading like a disease that has to be quarantined or the patient eliminated so it doesn't spread the disease to others. So they evolve what becomes known as the domino theory, that if, say, one country in Central America goes to communism, then the idea of communism will spread to the neighboring populations. They'll overthrow their governments, build communist dictatorships there, or communist economies with the Soviet-style dictatorship there, and then they'll form alliances with the Soviet Union. So it's a theoretical reach, but in this very paranoid era of American politics, a lot of Americans just believe it. And remember, these theories are being built in 1949, 1950, when you have this slew of events, the Soviet Union getting a bomb, the spread of communism to China, then the Korean invasion, that seem to justify all these beliefs step by step by step. So the American government is very worried, and they're going to start taking very dramatic steps to stop the growth of communism, even in poverty-ridden places. Does that make sense? Questions about that one at all? Okay, next one. The United States usually, in order to combat the growth of communism, the U.S. government usually wants to spend money to stop it, or send weapons. They usually want to find indigenous peoples in those areas to give money and weapons to fight off a communist invasion or a communist insurgency or the attempted communist overthrow of some kind of government that was already in office. So the U.S. will try to wage economic warfare first. Then they'll send guns to any resistance group, any anti-communist group they can possibly find in the area. If that doesn't work, in certain places they'll send in the U.S. Army to fight to stop the growth of communism. Why does the United States want to go through all these dramatic steps? Because they believe that if you allow communism to grow in one place, that will only encourage communists throughout the world to rise up. That they will gain confidence with each victory they get, no matter where it is in the world, no matter how small that country was or how poverty-ridden that country was. The U.S. government feeling is you cannot allow them to gain any momentum anywhere. Because if they do, then it's going to spread very quickly and the U.S. will lose the Cold War. So it's much like a lot of arguments you get today within what's called the War on Terror. You can't withdraw from Afghanistan no matter how poor the place is, no matter how strategically useless it is for U.S. power in a lot of ways. Why? Why can't the U.S. pull out? Because the military theorists say, if you surrender in Afghanistan, that will embolden, give confidence to the terrorists to take over other countries. It's the same exact theory. And one of the last ones is, in general, throughout the Cold War, the U.S. wants to avoid direct military conflict, especially with the Soviets. Why do you think that is? They have a big army, but they also have something else. They have the weapons, they have the missiles. So the U.S. will be unwilling, and the Soviets will be unwilling, to send in American and Soviet soldiers into one place at one time. Because if those American and Soviets start shooting at each other, and you get a couple soldiers killed on each side, that could start World War III, which could annihilate the Western world. And by the 1980s, threatens all life on the planet, not just human life. China doesn't get a bomb until somewhere around, I think, 1966, so a little bit later. So the U.S. again sends money, sends weapons, and throughout the rest of the Cold War, the Americans and the Soviets, and the Chinese eventually, will fight smaller wars, what we call proxy wars. They will hire soldiers in different parts of the world to fight for them. And they'll massively arm both sides. So that if you have, say, North Koreans and South Koreans killing each other, that's not going to cause World War III. If you send the American and Soviet forces and their tanks start shooting at each other, that could cause World War III very, very quickly. And that's something that both sides look to avoid as much as possible. And eventually we're still here, so they did. Okay, moving into, there's a whole lot of different countries that the United States gets involved in the so-called Third World throughout the Cold War. We obviously don't have the time to go through every single one, so I picked out about 4 or 5 to go through. We've already talked about Korea. Iran was another country that was newly independent, coming out of World War II. So you get a whole lot of newly, very much independent countries coming out of World War II, and also in North Africa and South and East Asia. Just because the European governments, like the British and French, just couldn't afford to keep their empires anymore. So Iran is just one of these. Iran holds national elections in 1952 to determine their own political leadership. So this is an election amongst the Iranian people. A president is chosen with a parliament. Number 1 on the president's agenda is to nationalize or have a government takeover of foreign oil companies in Iran, which are mostly American and British owned companies. So the government now announces in 1953 that those foreigners who own oil products or oil resources in Iran, that property is no longer theirs. That is now property of the Iranian government. The Iranian government wants to produce oil to boost its tax revenue, or its government revenue, to build things like hospitals and schools. Who do you think didn't like that idea very much? Yeah, the American and British oil companies, who stand to lose a massive amount of money. So particularly in the United States, leaders of those oil companies go to Washington, D.C. and convince the newly elected President Eisenhower to do something about Iran. And Eisenhower sends the CIA into Iran and basically pays different groups to start massive riots in the capital, Tehran. And those riots become so large that they eventually topple the democratically elected Iranian government. And the U.S. goes out and picks out the former royal family of Iran, a guy known as the Shah, puts him back in power in Iran, and gives him a whole lot of funding and a whole lot of CIA support to build up a secret police, Gestapo-type investigative tactics to destroy all of his potential enemies. And this guy is going to be the dictator of Iran until the 1970s. So he is very closely supported by the U.S. government because he follows orders. He stops the nationalization of the oil fields, brings back the foreign companies, and things are basically set back to the way they were. And that's not a controversial set of statements at all. It's very commonly accepted amongst historians that the U.S. government did this, and we now have access to the archives that prove it. But of course, the American government said, well, these are just the Iranian people rising up because they don't like the people who won those elections, so they're doing it themselves. But this guy becomes basically an American puppet for the rest of his time in office. So that's a very short history of Iran going into the 70s. And he creates a very repressive regime. All kinds of torture and executions and all kinds of horrid things in order to stay in power. A very similar story happens the next year in Guatemala, out here just south of Mexico. Guatemala basically had democratic elections, and I believe theirs were 1954. Elected indigenous government that starts doing many of the same things. This time they don't have giant oil fields. They have instead very large fruit fields, basically. And there is a giant American company, I think it's called United Fruit, that basically dominated the Guatemalan fruit market, grew things there very cheaply, hired very cheap labor there, and grew them and then imported them to the United States, and we're making a lot of money. When the new government in Guatemala comes into office, they start doing largely the same things. They decide they're going to nationalize the fruit industry, make it owned by the Guatemalan government, and they want to sell things to raise money to, again, build things like schools and hospitals and build up welfare programs and whatnot. The president launches a massive land redistribution system, because historians and economists now estimate that about 3% of the Guatemalan population, the richest 3%, owned about 70% of the land. So there's massive inequality in Guatemala, and the new president looks to undo that, basically confiscating a whole lot of land from the wealthy families and splicing it up into small pieces and giving it out to the poor so they can make a living themselves. And even did this to his own family's land. Again, United Fruit Company doesn't like this very much, so they go back to, this is a new group going to President Eisenhower, and they said it worked in Iran, so why not try it in Guatemala? And this time they even take U.S. warplanes and bomb certain places in Guatemala to destroy the government. They start riots. There's a massive public relations advertising campaign in the United States to try to convince the American people that this, again, is just the Guatemalan people rising up against their own hated government. But the U.S., through the CIA, again, overthrows the Guatemalan government, puts puppets in place that get rid of all those kinds of socialistic policies. And the U.S. government claims that the Guatemalan leaders were all communists. They're going to bring communism to Latin America. So that's an ongoing controversy also. But again, that stuff is all very well known throughout the world. It's only really controversial in the United States education system for some reason, and the voting public. But it's very well documented that all this stuff has happened. So questions about either of those two? All right. Then the big one comes along. The United States had basically ruled over Cuba for a long time, going back to the very late 1800s when the U.S. launched the war against Spain. By the 1950s, the U.S. government had such a close control over the Cuban leaders that Cuba was basically a giant kind of Disneyland-type playground for rich people in the United States to go down to Cuba and basically get involved in prostitution and drugs and a whole lot of different things that they weren't allowed to do in the United States. And the Cuban people were very heavily oppressed. It was a Cuban dictatorship that was closely supported by the United States until a very small group of revolutionaries start a war against the Cuban government in the hills in Cuba. Starts off with something like 7 or 8 guys. And their idea of overthrowing the Cuban government was so popular amongst Cuban victims of their own government, that many farmers and other men go and join Castro's revolution, to the point where by 1959 Castro has taken over large parts of the island and even conquers Havana and pushes the U.S.-backed regime out. Immediately, Castro says he's going to hold free elections. He declares himself to be prime minister at first. But Castro keeps a pretty close hold over Cuban policy, both internally, domestically, and foreign policy. The Eisenhower administration immediately declares Castro to basically be an outlaw, and the U.S. starts an embargo of Cuba, many ways which still last to this very day, to try to strangle the Cuban economy and destroy Castro's government at birth. The Eisenhower administration also starts drawing up plans for an invasion of Cuba, so that if the economic pressure didn't, force Castro to give up, they were going to take a whole bunch of Cuban refugees who had supported the former government, the toppled government, who had gone to Florida, train them militarily, give them a bunch of guns, send them back on boats to try to retake Cuba and destroy Castro's government with full U.S. air support, which means U.S. bombing of Cuban forces in order to force Castro to give up. Castro also, in 1959, starts moving toward socialistic policies because it's a fairly poor country. He nationalizes a bunch of foreign businesses. He starts opening foreign relations with the Soviet Union and starts agreeing to sell food that's grown in Cuba to the Soviets, because the Soviets are starting to have problems growing enough food for their own population. So that really sets the Americans off, believing that Castro is a hardcore revolutionary. He wants to have communism in Cuba, not just in Cuba, but he talks about spreading it to the rest of Latin America to resist American power. And he sees the Soviet Union as the most natural ally in doing this. And basically at that point, the American government quickens the plot to invade Cuba and overthrow him and have him assassinated somehow. The invasion doesn't happen in Eisenhower's term in office. Eisenhower is elected in 52 and 56. At this point, the Constitution has been changed so that a person could only serve 2 terms as president. There's a term limit on the presidency right to this very moment. So the Eisenhower administration is going out because a new president will be elected in 1960. John F. Kennedy wins that election, goes into office in January 1961, sees the invasion plans for Cuba on his desk, and Kennedy has a decision to make. Kennedy and his leaders decide to go ahead with the Eisenhower Plan. Their plan is to not just launch refugee forces, basically anti-Castro forces, right against Havana, but to land them at a different place called the Bay of Pigs, which was supposed to be a secret landing. And they were basically supposed to wait for Castro's forces to come out to fight, and then the U.S. Air Force was supposed to bomb them into complete destruction. It appears that Castro somehow got word that this invasion was going to happen and even knew where it was going to happen before it even started. So there's a leak somewhere in the U.S. government. And when the Kennedy administration leaders realize that Castro knows what's going on, they don't want to be caught trying to overthrow a foreign government through military means, so they pull back the planes. So the U.S. Air Force does not launch the bombing raids. And so the Cuban refugees who are going to fight against Castro's forces are basically thrown onto the beach and they're either killed or captured. And everyone in the world knows that this is backed by the U.S. government, so Kennedy has to go on TV and say, yes, it was my decision, it was a mistake. He has to really accept it and announce to the world that he's not going to just pass this off on some other leader, that this was his decision. But the problem of Cuba has not been solved from the American perspective. They still want to take out Castro. Kennedy approves plans to assassinate Castro. And it gets into all kinds of Bugs Bunny kind of scenarios where they're going to have exploding cigars to blow his head off and all kinds of different things. So all that stuff is very real. And it's very well known that the U.S. government continued supporting terroristic attacks against Castro's government. They bomb Cuban factories to destroy its industry. They take naval boats, warships, small warships, and sail along the coastline of Cuba and shoot at Cuban hotels and kill hundreds and hundreds of people. So the U.S. attempt to overthrow the Cuban government is ongoing for the next few years. And the new leader of the Soviet Union, yeah.
Given what happened in Iran and where was the other place?
Guatemala.
Wasn't Castro kind of forced to become a dictator, essentially?
Forced? I don't know. I wouldn't say forced, but.
But what if free elections would have been too corrupt, given what the U.S. has did prior to that?
I haven't studied the history of Castro's planning and why he would have decided to not hold those elections. So I don't know it would be a very important and interesting history to read what changed his mind. But I just haven't done that reading, so I don't have much of an answer for that at all. I just don't have the information. But Castro is concerned for his own survival, obviously, and the Soviets were too, because the Soviets see Cuba as an example, and from the Soviet perspective, a great example for all the poor people of the Western Hemisphere to rise up against their oppressors. And their oppressors had historically been the U.S. government, U.S. companies, and capitalism in general. As we've talked about before, the United States had launched invasions, interventions, whatever you want to call them, of Latin America and South America going far back into the 1800s. This is nothing new. U.S. foreign policy considered the Americas to be their doorstep or their backyard, or they have all these euphemisms, as if the United States actually owns those places. So what you have here is what one commentator says literally is, in his words, the threat of a good example. That the Cubans had actually been able to rise up against U.S. influence and get rid of the U.S.-backed government and establish something that could work for the Cuban people more than for for U.S. interests. And the new Soviet leader, Khrushchev, was very aware of this. You know, the number one thing that Khrushchev or any Soviet leader wants is to embarrass the United States somewhere and show the hypocrisies of the U.S. claim. The U.S. claim of freedom when you're living under this capitalist dictatorship in the Soviet minds. So in their mind, Cuba is the great and shining example for the rest of the Latin American peoples, South American peoples, everywhere, that this can be done. You can resist the United States, so why not rise up and start doing it? And Castro himself called out for others to do similar things. And the people in his revolution in Cuba even go to other countries in the Western Hemisphere. Right? Che Guevara went to, was it Bolivia? To start a Bolivian revolution against U.S.-backed leaders. They want to export the revolution. They want to grow it. And Khrushchev and the Soviets were very aware of this. So they take extreme steps to protect Castro. They not only send him money, they send him weapons. And when the weapons even looked like it wasn't going to stop the U.S. from attempting a new invasion at some point, the Soviets send the one thing that will guarantee that the U.S. won't attack. They send nuclear weapons. So Khrushchev sent, that's what are called ballistic missiles, atomic weapons, to be assembled in Cuba as a direct threat against, if the U.S. launches a new invasion, then the Cubans now have missiles to fire at Washington, D.C. So you'll have basically a Hiroshima happening in the U.S. Capitol as a direct threat against, if you invade us, we're going to do it. So it's a deterrence theory. Don't invade us. The Kennedy administration considers that to be an international crime, basically, which is a strange thing to argue because the United States was doing this exact same thing in different parts of the world. So the Kennedy administration flew a bunch of planes over Cuba with cameras and took pictures of the Soviet missile sites being built around the Cuban islands. Took that evidence to the United Nations and the U.S. public within just a few days in late October 1962. So this is Kennedy on the left, literally going on television and telling the American people the Cubans are now building nuclear weapons. The United States will not allow that. The United States will eliminate that threat one way or another. And Stevenson is the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. So Stevenson takes all these photographs to the UN and gives absolute, complete, perfect evidence that the Soviets are doing this. And here's a picture at the Security Council of Stevenson arguing with the Soviet ambassador. Soviets try to deny it as much as they possibly can, but really no one in the world's buying it. And the U.S. treats this as an international crime, as a violation of some kind of deal that was never in place. The Soviets have the right to do this with their military allies, right? Just as the United States had the right to do that when it took nuclear weapons to Britain, France, Israel, West Germany, Turkey, as it did. But obviously Americans don't want to talk about that too much.
They didn't know about that information to use it against them at the time? I mean, if they were taking that to the United Nations, why couldn't they use that against them if they were
they try to keep it secret.
Oh, okay.
So the missiles in Turkey are supposedly secret at that point.
The people in Cuba, they had no idea that was going on at the time?
That they're putting missiles in Cuba?
No, that the U.S. was giving nuclear weapons to other countries as well. Were they unaware of that used against them?
It would have been easy to know if you're a person who follows this kind of stuff, right? Mm-hmm. But it's not something that gets out in the general U.S. media. So most Americans would have been shocked at that idea. But it's very true. It's just like today, the country Israel has many nuclear weapons, but the government officially denies it. And they're basically the only government that we know of in the world that has those weapons that doesn't want to admit to it. But if you're the kind of person who follows the news and you follow foreign policy, it's pretty easy to kind of put the jigsaw pieces together and understand what's going on. But most of the U.S. public doesn't, right? They want to go to movies and watch their football games or whatever they do on a daily basis. So just like a lot of stuff we're talking about tonight already is really controversial to a lot of Americans, but it's not to people who study this stuff, people who keep up with this stuff on any level. This is all common knowledge. This is a pretty useful map in a lot of ways that shows there's several missile sites in Cuba. Obviously, those missiles can fly to hit Miami because it's close. But you also see the radius of these missiles that could hit as far away as Houston and all the way up to Washington, D.C. The estimated flight time on one of those missiles to fly from Cuba to hit Washington, D.C. was about 30 seconds. So that eliminates the ability of the U.S. government to officially launch counterattack, right? Because their city's going to be destroyed before they can even probably be aware that the attack has happened or was ongoing. So Kennedy's proposal, he has a lot of different options on the table. He can launch airstrikes against the missile sites. Some of his leaders are saying, well, they're not ready to fire yet, so you may be able to destroy them all and they won't launch a missile against us. Who knows? You can launch the U.S. Marines to completely invade Cuba, destroy Castro's government. He chooses the safest option, which was to take the U.S. Navy and surround Cuba in a blockade. Kennedy doesn't use the word blockade because that is an act of war, so he calls it a quarantine. Why does he want to set up a quarantine? Because there's other Soviet ships sailing through the Atlantic Ocean bringing more missiles. And the reason the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis is so important is because those Soviet ships, those Soviet Navy ships, are sailing through the Atlantic Ocean on their way to Cuba. And with the American Navy sitting in front of Cuba, there's going to be a conflict, right? And people sit down and they estimate how fast those Soviet ships are moving, and they say, okay, on a Thursday morning at about 11 a.m., they're going to meet. And that could be the end of the world. Because when the U.S. and Soviet militaries hit each other, you have the real possibility of World War III. So a few days, literally, about the whole northern hemisphere, all of Europe, the Soviet Union, and North America, didn't know if the world was going to exist in another week. They literally thought that the world might end, or at least their world might end, when this happened. So day after day, the Soviet ships keep moving closer and closer. The American and Soviet governments start negotiating with each other, trying to find a way out of this crisis. The problem is that neither of them wants to back down, because if you back down, you get seen as the weaker side, right? So the Soviets don't want to back down because that would be seen as selling out the Cubans, selling out Castro, which could hurt the willingness of other Latin American people to rise up. The Americans don't want to back down because if they do, they may be seen as weaker, which could encourage the rest of the Latin American peoples to rise up and overthrow U.S.-backed dictatorships in different places. So this is a big mess. And if you ever talk to your parents or maybe grandparents by now, there's a real good article on these last few days because it was the 50th anniversary of this stuff, just a few weeks ago. So it was something that was heavily discussed. And this, a lot of scholars believe, is the closest that the U.S. has come to a nuclear war since World War II. The closest that the world has ever come to nuclear annihilation. Eventually, right as the ships are getting very close to Cuba, the Soviets backed down. They backed down when Kennedy offered them a deal to withdraw missiles from Turkey, which Turkey is right on the Soviet border, so this was seen as an equal deal. If the Americans take the missiles out of Turkey, which they'd already planned to do anyway, then the Soviets would take the missiles out of Cuba, and both sides could relax on an equal basis. And that was the deal that was eventually struck. And the Cuban Missile Crisis was averted, so we're still alive. But this was a very scary thing for a whole lot of people. Questions about that at all? And maybe just to slam the point home, I have a little video to show you. So this is going to be the same guy that talked about the atomic bombing of Japan in World War II. He was also heavily involved, one of the highest level officials in the Kennedy administration. So, yep, that thread is still around today. So, sleep tight. Okay, so that's about it for Cuba. Questions about Cuba at all? Okay. There's another little country that most textbooks will also overlook. You'll get a lot usually on Cuban textbooks. This place is called Guyana, which is up here, this little orange country up in the northeastern part of South America. Guyana was a British colony for many, many decades. That the British really decided to allow to become an independent country after World War II. Guyana was built on the basis of slavery. It was that old of a colony. So they had you had a lot of indigenous people from South America who lived in the area. Then the British came in and colonized, and then the British started bringing in African slaves. So you have three major different racial groups in Guyana at the time of the British starting to leave and allow Guyana to become an independent country. So again, also like a lot of these other countries, they start holding national elections. The major politician of Guyana's name is Cheddi Jagan. He organizes a political party called People's Progressive Party, I believe, the PPP. So they win the elections, they win the parliamentary elections. He becomes prime minister, or he will lead the new government going in. And he starts talking about a lot of things that he wants to do, which seem to be basic kinds of things that a lot of governments do when they have an impoverished society. They build up low-cost housing for the poor. They build up schools, universal education, workers' compensation, so for people who are injured at work. They start building hospitals, all those kinds of things. The U.S. government, though, does not trust Jagan. They think that his policies are too, quote, communistic. So that he's going overboard beyond the normal boundaries of socialism, and he's going into being a communist. He's getting into communist territory. U.S. foreign policy leaders start talking about Jagan as a possible Soviet puppet, which is difficult to understand because he and his party won the elections. The Americans largely convinced the British to also fear Jagan getting into power to the point where the British are convinced to go back and retake power over Guyana and delay its independence movement. So they basically kicked Jagan out of office in, I believe, 1954, and basically the British come back in and set up a new colonial dictatorship run by Britain. They set new elections for 1956, I believe, and Jagan's party again wins the elections, and he becomes the next prime minister. At this point, the British feel that Jagan is trustworthy enough. He's not going to sign any kind of military alliance with the Soviets or anything. So Jagan and his party now actually go into power. Guyana is now moving toward independence, but the Americans are still afraid of him. In the late 50s, in 59, when Castro takes control over Cuba, Jagan actually meets with Castro's government, opens foreign relations with Cuba under Castro, which is a very scary thing for the United States. The United States now looks at Jagan as a kind of Castro-type revolutionary who wants to spread communism throughout all of Latin and South America. Jagan appears to have been much more interested in simple trade relations. So the eventual trade deal that they strike is that Guyana will sell rice to Cuba. Rice was Guyana's #1 export, without doubt. So the American government starts looking at Jagan in particular as a communist and a possible person who wants to align with the Soviets and start the large-scale communist revolution, or grow the communist revolution in the Western Hemisphere. So the U.S. government starts taking steps to knock Jagan out of power and choose who the next leaders of Guyana will be. Jagan's government, though, is hugely impoverished. This is one of the poorest places in the world. There's just appalling levels of misery in this place. There's famine, starvation. It's a really horrible place. So Jagan actually goes to Washington, D.C. and gets a meeting with President Kennedy personally. This is a picture from that meeting where Jagan comes in and basically requests financial aid from the United States to build up Guianan infrastructure and really get that country going to the point where it could be independent and survive by itself economically. Kennedy literally says, yes, we'll give you the money, to his face, but once Jagan goes back home, the Kennedy administration not only slows down the money, they cut it off completely, and then they start promoting race riots in the Guianan capital to destabilize Jagan's government and try to knock him out of power. And that's official U.S. government policy from 1962 to 1964, when the final kind of massive violence in the capital city in Guyana eventually does force Jagan to resign. New elections are held, and at this point, 1964, Kennedy's already been killed. So another politician and his party, the PNC, rise. They tend to win what seems to be a fraudulent election in 64. They go into power, and this is basically a dictatorship. But like a lot of dictatorships, they hold elections every once in a while, and then they just manipulate them to, make sure that the people they liked won. And this is done with the full backing of, at this point, the Johnson administration, the leaders of the U.S. government. This politician, Forbes Burnham, creates a military dictatorship in Guyana that is based in racism and segregation. And anyone who complains is tortured, if not executed. So this is very clear U.S. government backing of one of the more horrid dictatorships on the planet at that point. And American leaders understand that Burnham is doing this inside his own country, but Burnham always promises to be an anti-communist. He says, I will never allow the communists to take over this country, so he gets full U.S. backing, and will even beyond the end of the Cold War. His government, Burnham's government, doesn't end until 1992 when Burnham himself dies. And that causes an uprising amongst the oppressed people. And they hold one of the first real free votes. Almost 40 years at that point. And at that point, Guyana actually gets an elected representative government that ever since has been functioning. So this is another instance where the U.S. is backing a pretty, horrid dictatorship just because they promised to keep the communists out. So questions about Guyana at all? And
you said they started like racial riots and everything.
yes, the U.S. government under the CIA gave money to different racial groups to basically go out in the streets and start breaking things. It was very similar to especially what happened in Iran. Not so much with racist groups in Iran, but different political groups. They were literally paid by the CIA. The CIA took over suitcases full of cash.
So they back up movements that are going on in foreign countries that will be of benefit to them?
To the American government, in their view, to destabilize and eliminate a government that is resisting what the United States wants for that region. So the history of this stuff is long, it's deep, and there's a whole lot of countries we could talk about, but obviously we don't have the big amount of time to do so. But now we'll get to the big one. This causes big problems for U.S. foreign policy. Vietnam and the whole system of countries in Southeast Asia were all ruled by France. These were part of the French Empire until the end of World War II. France tried to hold on to this part of their empire after World War II. So the French continued to send in armies into Southeast Asia to keep control over what had been basically a French colony for many centuries by that point. The French, over time, are overwhelmed by an indigenous, especially Vietnamese, revolutionary movement to kick the French out. The Vietnamese had declared independence from France. They had issued their own Declaration of Independence, where they quoted the American Declaration of Independence, talking about liberty and freedom and whatnot, and said that during World War II, when the Japanese invaded this area, the French basically ran away. So the Vietnamese say, you deserted us in our hour of need, so we're not even going to consider you protectors anymore. So we want to have our own country. They finally beat in one large battle in 1954. They defeat the French forces, so the French will withdraw. They will leave Vietnam. But they asked the United States to continue the war in order to keep communists out of power in Vietnam. And the major Vietnamese revolutionary, Ho Chi Minh, was basically an avowed communist. And in 1954, they write up what's called the Geneva Agreement, where they split Vietnam into two parts along the 17th parallel, about here. The northern part will fall basically under Ho Chi Minh's leadership. The southern part will fall under another government. And they say in a few years, in a couple years, we're going to have national elections for all of Vietnam, where they will vote for their leaders, and then Vietnam will be reunified under one government. The American fear, though, is that Ho Chi Minh is basically kind of George Washington of Vietnam, and if any election was held, that he was probably going to win. And he's a communist. So the American government basically torpedoes the Geneva Convention once 56 comes around, and decides to start sending, number one, supporting the southern government, which was starting to look more like a dictatorship than anything else, was not elected by the southern people, and was actually brutalizing the people using torture and all these kind of different tactics to stay in power. The Eisenhower administration seemed to have decided that they didn't want to send in the U.S. Army to defend South Vietnam or try to take over the North. They decided instead just to send military advisors to the South to try to build up a Southern army that would be able to resist any attempted Northern invasion. So Eisenhower's administration is often looking at Vietnam as like a Korea. It's divided between a Northern communist area and a Southern kind of pro-U.S. area. And at this point, the Korean War is still very close in mind to a lot of American people, so they don't want to send in U.S. forces. They just want to build up the Southern army to resist. So that's Eisenhower's basic stand on Vietnam. They send in a lot of military hardware, a lot of weapons, and a lot of training, a lot of money into the South to try to support basically the Southern dictator, Diem. The Kennedy administration comes in, and the Kennedy administration comes in 1961 and doesn't seem to know what to do regarding Vietnam. There's a lot of debate. They send in increasing amounts of military advisors, but they hesitate to ever send in large U.S. forces. The Kennedy administration's main tactics seem to be to try to force the Diem regime to become more democratic, to be more open and not as oppressive of its own people, to get the trust and the support of the Southern people. But Diem is basically a too-big dictator, and he doesn't give up those kinds of ways. So the Kennedy administration continues sending in advisors to try and money to try to build up the Southern army, with the feeling that if the North ever invades, then the Southern army will be able to resist. The Northern communist forces are also starting to use insurgency type of tactics, hit and run type tactics in the South. So they start sending Northern soldiers and supplies into the South to hide and perform bombings and attacks against Southern forces. And those Northerners who go into the South are called the Viet Cong. Or at least that's the American term for them. But the Kennedy administration is very much back and forth on what to do. They never seem to have come to much of a decision. The biggest decision they made eventually was that they didn't trust Diem at all and decided to get rid of him, with the hope that the next leadership would be so threatened that they would follow orders from Washington. And the way they got rid of Diem was to support a coup against him, which eventually killed him and his family. Took him into the back of a truck and, as you can see, blew his head off. So the Diem regime is eliminated, and I believe it's the first week of November 1963, with full knowledge and support of the CIA. And the Kennedy feeling is that, the next leaders who come into power will get the message. If you don't follow orders from Washington, this stuff will happen to you too. And the next step in the problem is that the next Southern leaders come in and they basically don't change anything, because they realize that Washington has to support somebody in this area. So they put pressure on Washington to continue supporting them. Ironically, Kennedy himself is assassinated just a couple weeks after this happens. So you're going to get a new leader in Washington, D.C. And the vice president in November 1963 comes into power and takes the presidency. His name is Lyndon Johnson. And he has some major policy problems to deal with. This is going into late 63. 64 is the re-election year. So Johnson's going to run for re-election in 64 in November. Johnson is mostly a domestic policy person. He is very interested on creating a better, especially healthcare system and poverty elimination system for the United States. So Johnson is almost completely a domestic-minded, economic-minded U.S. president. It is pretty clear in early 64 that his Republican opponent in the 64 election is going to be the rising conservative from Arizona, Barry Goldwater. And Goldwater is what we call a hawk in politics. He is a very pro-war type of candidate. And he really runs his campaign assaulting the Johnson administration for being too weak in Vietnam, for not standing up against the communists. So Johnson realizes that in order to be seen as a strong foreign policy leader to get reelected, Johnson has to do something regarding Vietnam to show how willing he is to use force. And as Johnson even said privately, the American population doesn't really elect wusses to run foreign policy, right? They don't elect the weak. They elect people who are strong and who talk a big game. So Johnson had his administration draw up a list of bombing targets in the north, in northern Vietnam, to show off how willing he is to use force before the election. And so you have a whole lot of U.S. also boats patrolling in the Gulf of Tonkin, which is an area just east of, on the coastline of northern Vietnam. Something happened in August of 64 where one of these U.S. ships claimed to have been attacked by a northern Vietnamese gunboat, which now seems very murky to the point where we don't even know if attack even happened or not. This is known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and Johnson used this so-called attack, brought a message to Congress asking for increased power to launch bombing raids against the North. And he said it was going to be limited. So the Gulf of Tonkin resolution goes forward and gets almost unanimous support from Congress. There's only, I think, 2 senators and like 3 people in the House of Representatives who vote against it out of 535 votes. So the Gulf of Tonkin resolution gives Johnson the power to literally start bombing the North in order to get them to give up their attempt to overthrow the Southern government. Does all this make sense so far? And in the U.S. presidential election, Johnson wins overwhelmingly. So this strategy paid off for him politically. And you can see this is also where the southern states vote against Johnson and the Democratic Party. Why is that? Because Johnson pushed the Civil Rights Amendment, which gave guaranteed voting rights to racial minorities, and the Southerners didn't like it. And they punished Johnson for it by voting Republican in that very same year's election. And obviously you get Goldwater in Arizona. And this is where you start to see the South turn against the Democratic Party because they're conservative. And this is really one of the endpoints where the Democrats have now become the more liberal of the 2 parties, and the Republicans are turning toward the more conservative. And that's only grown since, especially with the South. Johnson himself was from Texas, so he carried Texas fairly easily. So he is also seen as a Southerner. So he carried a lot of Southern states, but not all. Johnson is now reelected, so he's going to serve a second term going into 1968. That'll be the next election year. And it appears that after his election, things start changing very quickly, especially in relation to Vietnam. Johnson's number 1 priority is to pass all this domestic, economic, social program stuff that he called the Great Society. Elimination of poverty, what he called the war on poverty. This is where you eventually get Medicare and Medicaid becoming reality under Johnson's watch in '65. So he was very much focused on domestic stuff that he wanted to do. And he viewed the Vietnam War as a distraction. U.S. military analysts believe, and there's some evidence for this, that once the North Vietnamese realized that Johnson was reelected, they start with invasion attempts against the South very quickly, or at least planning in the winter of '64 going into '65. And President Johnson meets at his ranch in Texas with his highest level military advisors, which is to me a funny picture of, the biggest U.S. generals in the whole country sitting in lawn chairs. But they literally go to his place to plan how to eliminate North Vietnam as a threat, to basically bomb the North into submission. He continues sending military advisors into the South, but because these guys want to start really constant bombing of northern targets, northern factories, military installations, even some population centers, they're going to have to build U.S. air bases in South Vietnam to constantly launch the planes and refuel and whatnot, resupply. So you're going to get a growth of U.S. Air Force bases in the South. These planners are also very worried that these air bases will come under attack. So they also decide to send in defensive U.S. soldiers to guard the bases. So in March of '65, you're going to get the first landings of U.S. Marines in South Vietnam. They start building the bases. The bombings begin, and the northern government is, not dumb. They know where those bombs are coming from. So they decide to start launching attacks against those air bases. So you're going to start getting soldier-to-soldier fighting between the U.S. Army and U.S. Marines against northern forces and southern insurgents. They will basically run hit and run kinds of raids where they will attack the base and then run off into the jungle so you can't really hit them back. So eventually the Johnson administration gives permission for the soldiers at these air bases to go into the jungles and try to make contact with the enemy. So they're going to bring in increasing amounts of U.S. soldiers for the next few years in a desperate attempt to completely annihilate the Northern Resistance Movement or the Southern Insurgency, whichever way you want to look at it. So you see here on the right side, U.S. troops in Vietnam from early '65 start growing at a very quick rate. This is in the thousands. So you go from about 10,000 in '64 to over somewhere around 200,000 in '65. And it grows and grows and grows to its peak of about 500,000 in 1967 going into '68. And obviously, along with that, you have more troops in the area. The casualty amounts start to grow very quickly and reach their peak also in 1968. And the United States will lose something I believe on the number of 55,000 troops in Vietnam over the next few years. And that starts a massive wave of protests that eventually take down Johnson and his direct inheritors. So questions about anything regarding Vietnam so far? This is how the U.S. gets in, and it gets difficult, increasingly difficult from there for everybody involved. The U.S. will eventually lose the war, even though they kill something on the order of 2.5 million Vietnamese people. So this becomes one of the big modern slaughters in the 20th century, especially in U.S. history.